There are three kinds of silence out here, on the far side of the moon. The first is the perfect, absolute silence of the vacuum, just beyond the triple-paned viewport. It's a scientific silence, the absence of a medium for sound to travel. It's honest. It makes no promises. I can look out at the sea of dead gray dust and the endless spray of stars, and that silence is a comfort, a known quantity. The second is the communication silence. The 27-day lunar night has swallowed us whole, and Earth is a ghost on the other side of this rock. There are no messages, no data streams, no familiar voices from mission control. We are adrift in a sea of static. This silence is one of loneliness, a constant, low-grade ache in the pit of my stomach that reminds me we are 239,000 miles from everything that has ever mattered. Then there is the third kind of silence, the one inside tenebrous base. This one is the worst, because it's not truly silent at all. It's the silence that lives in the hum of the life support systems. On paper, it's a steady C-sharp, the sound of survival. But when you've been sealed in this metal tomb for 284 days, you start to hear the notes between the notes. The hum isn't steady. It's a choir of a dying machine. Its pitch shifting by imperceptible, maddening fractions. It feels less like a function and more like a complaint. My name is Dr. Eris Thorne. I'm the station's geologist, and my job is to chronicle monotony. Each day, I guide the rover remotely across the cratered plains, drill core samples, and bring them back to my lab pod. I analyze the dust of ages, looking for helium-3, water ice, and mineralogical clues to the moon's violent birth. It's work that requires patience and precision, a methodical cataloging of a world that hasn't changed in 3 billion years. But the routine is a fragile shield. The psychological strain is a physical presence here. The long, white corridors of the main habitat module seem to breathe. Shadows, cast by the unwavering emergency lights, stretch and contract at the very edge of my vision. Sometimes I'll turn quickly, certain I saw a flicker of movement, only to be met with the sterile, still geometry of the hallway. The station isn't just a shelter, it's a test, and I feel like I'm failing. We are a crew of 3, each of us clinging to our own brand of sanity. Commander Eva Rostova is our rock, or perhaps our jailer. A former cosmonaut with a spine straighter than the struts holding up the ceiling, she runs Tenebris with an iron will. Her adherence to protocol is absolute, bordering on religious. Every report must be filed in triplicate, every checklist double verified, every meal consumed at the exact designated time. I once submitted a geological survey 5 minutes past the deadline. And the look she gave me wasn't one of annoyance, but of profound disappointment, as if I'd personally allowed chaos to breach the airlock. I see it for what it is, a desperate, white-knuckled attempt to impose order on a place where the laws of man feel like a flimsy suggestion. Her rigidity isn't leadership, it's a prayer against the madness she feels creeping in, same as me. Then there's Kenji Tanaka, our engineer. If Rostova is the station's rigid skeleton, Kenji is its frantic, overworked heart. He is a blur of perpetual motion, his tool belt a permanent fixture on his waist. He's always crawling into a maintenance duct, coaxing a failing water reclaimer back to life, or rewiring a flickering console. The sounds of his work, the gentle tink-tink of a wrench, the soft whir of a diagnostic tool, are the only things that ever break the station's unnerving hum. He's the only reason Tenebris hasn't buckled under the strain of its own age. His constant, grease-stained optimism is a stark contrast to Rostova's grim stoicism, but I see the exhaustion in his eyes. He knows, better than any of us, how close we are to total system failure. He's patching a sinking ship in the middle of a cosmic ocean. And me? I am the observer. I watch them both, and I watch the dust. My days are spent staring at screens, at readouts, at microscopic views of lunar regolith. The monotony should be a comfort, a predictable rhythm. Instead, it's given my mind too much space to wander. to notice the hum that's just a little off-key, the shadows that dance when they shouldn't. We are a fragile sanctuary in a vast, uncaring void. 3 souls in a tin can, held together by Rostovo's rules, Kenji's repairs, and my increasingly frayed nerves. We pretend this is a mission, we pretend this is science. But some nights, when the station groans and the silence presses in, I know what Tenebrous Base truly is. It's a tomb, waiting for its occupants. And the silence on the far side of the moon isn't empty. It listens. Day 285 began with a flicker of purpose, a welcome break from the grinding routine. The mission plan called for a long-range rover expedition to the rim of the Shackleton crater, where preliminary scans had shown unusually high concentrations of creep, potassium, rare earth elements, and phosphorus. It was the kind of geological anomaly that could rewrite textbooks. For the first time in weeks, I felt a spark of the scientist I used to be, not just the glorified drone pilot I'd become. I sat in the command module, the heart of Tenebrous. The air tasted of recycled oxygen and ozone from the humming server racks. My hands, gloved in thin, anti-static material, rested on the controls. The joystick felt worn and familiar beneath my palm. On the main screen, a high-definition feed showed the world through the rover's forward camera, a landscape of breathtaking, monochrome desolation. Rover Odyssey is mobile. All systems green, I announced into the quiet room. Acknowledged, Dr. Thorne. Commander Rostova's voice was clipped, precise. She stood behind me, arms crossed, her reflection a stern ghost in the dark screen. Maintain designated route. We have a tight window before the next comms shadow. From the corner of the room came a series of metallic clicks and a frustrated sigh. And I've got the primary oxygen scrubber wheezing like a dying asthmatic, Kenji muttered, his head buried in a wall panel overflowing with wires. Trying to keep us from suffocating on our own bad jokes. Go easy on the rover's power draw, Eris. I'm rerouting everything I can spare to life support. Copy that, Kenji? I guided the Odyssey forward, its 6-wheeled chassis kicking up plumes of fine gray dust that hung in the vacuum like suspended ghosts. The kilometers ticked by. The base was a receding speck in the rear camera, soon swallowed by the curve of a crater wall. There was just the rover, the dust, and the silent, watching stars. The hum of the command module was my universe. The first time I saw it, I dismissed it. A flicker on the horizon, just to the left of the crater's distant, sun-drenched rim. A visual artifact, I thought. A cosmic ray striking the camera sensor. It happened. I blinked, refocused, and kept driving. But it was still there. Huck! I slowed the rover to a halt. My fingers tightened on the joystick. It wasn't a flicker, it was a shape. I zoomed the camera in, the digital magnification straining. Pixels blurring at the edges. But the shape itself remained sharp. Horribly, impossibly sharp. Sharp. It was a perfect rectangle. A monolith of pure, featureless black standing stark against the starfield. It wasn't a shadow. Shadows on the moon are deep. But they still have texture, a subtle diffusion of light. This was different. This was an absence. It didn't block the stars behind it. It consumed them. It was as if someone had taken a pair of scissors to the fabric of reality and cut a piece of it out. A hole in the stars. My heart began to hammer against my ribs. "Commander," I said, my voice barely a whisper, "you need to see this." Rostova stepped forward, her eyes narrowing at the screen. "What is it, Doctor? A rock formation?" "No. Look, on the horizon." I pointed a trembling finger at the display. Telemetry shows nothing there. No mass, no energy reading. The light spectrometer is reading 0 photons. It's void. She stared for a full 10 seconds, her expression unreadable. "It's a sensor ghost, Thorne. A processing artifact from the extreme light contrast on the crater rim. recalibrate the camera array. I did, I said, my voice rising with an urgency I couldn't control. Twice. It's still there. This isn't a glitch, Eva. It's physical. Her use of my last name was a warning. Her tone sharpened, turning from professional to condescending. Dr. Thorne, it's a trick of the light, a shadow cast by an unmapped peak. We are on a mission with a strict timetable. A shadow wouldn't be a perfect geometric shape, I protested, turning to face her. And it wouldn't be blacker than the space around it. Look at it. Her eyes were cold steel. Are you feeling all right, Eris? The isolation protocol is in effect for a reason. This environment can play tricks on the mind. The accusation hung in the air, thick and suffocating. She thought I was cracking. She thought the weight of the silence had finally broken me. I turned to our only other crewmate for support. Kenji? Tell me you see this. Kenji glanced over his shoulder, his face smudged with grease. He squinted at the screen for a moment. See what? The black splotch? Looks like a dead pixel cluster to me, man. A loud hiss erupted from the panel he was working on, followed by a flurry of red warning lights on a nearby console. Ah, hell. Sorry, Iris, I've got a real problem here. The CO2 scrubbers are about to go on strike. He turned back to his work, dismissing the impossible thing on my screen without a second thought. I was alone. I turned back to the monitor. Rostova had returned to her station, pointedly ignoring me. Kenji was lost in his battle with the dying station. It was just me and the feed from the rover. I stared at the black rectangle on the horizon, the hole in reality. It hadn't moved. It didn't waver. It simply existed, a silent, geometric god in a landscape of curves and dust. The seed of paranoia Rostova had planted wasn't just a seed. It felt like a fully grown, thorny vine wrapping around my heart. I was the only one who saw it. In this fragile sanctuary, sealed against the vast, uncaring void, a new kind of silence had just begun. The silence of being the only one who knows the monster is at the door. The silence that followed Rostova's dismissal was heavier than the moon's weak gravity. In the command module, Kenji's frantic work on the oxygen scrubber provided a counterpoint of rhythmic, desperate noise. Rostova stood at the main observation port, staring into the void as if she could will the Earth back into view. And I sat at my console, a prisoner of the rover's camera feed. I couldn't look away. I toggled between magnifications, ran pointless diagnostic checks on the camera, and overlaid the image with topographical maps that showed nothing but flat, unremarkable terrain where the silhouette stood. Each negative result was another brick in the wall separating me from my crewmates. They saw a glitch. I saw an omen. An hour crawled by. My focus had narrowed to that single, obscene rectangle on the horizon. The creep deposit, the mission, the science, it had all evaporated, replaced by a primal, burning need to understand what I was looking at. Then a klaxon shattered the quiet. A piercing, three-tone alarm screamed through the station, and every secondary monitor flashed a violent crimson. It was the solar storm warning, an event we'd drilled for, but one you pray never actually happens. Rostova spun from the window, her entire demeanor snapping into focus. The aloof, dismissive commander was gone, replaced by a field general facing down artillery. "Report!" she barked, her voice cutting through the alarm. Kenji was already at a different console, his fingers flying across the keypad. "It's a big one, Commander. Coronal mass ejection, Class 10. We were on the wrong side of the moon to get a warning. It's coming in hot and fast. Full proton storm will hit in 70 minutes. 70 minutes. A lifetime, and no time at all." "Emergency protocols now," Rostova commanded. "Tanaka, secure all non-essential systems and power down the main grid. Divert everything to the shelter's life support. Thorne, shut down the rover and recall it immediately. We can't leave it exposed. Its radioisotope generator will fry." Her orders were a lifeline. For a moment, the shared, tangible threat of the solar flare united us. I nodded, my fingers finding the rover's command sequence. My own fear of the silhouette felt distant, almost foolish, in the face of a wave of radiation that could cook us alive. I initiated the recall macro, and on the screen, the Odyssey pivoted smoothly and began its long journey back to Tenebris. My job was simple: monitor its progress, manage its power, and prepare my own research pod for shutdown. I methodically worked through the checklist, my hands steady, my mind focused. Power down the seismograph, retract the external sensors, secure the sample containers. Quilius, as I finalized the sequence for my pod, a cold, nagging thought slithered into my mind. The rover was coming back, which meant its rear-facing camera was now pointed directly at the path it had just traveled. Pointed at the horizon where the silhouette stood. My heart began to thud a heavy, syncopated rhythm against the wail of the alarm. With a trembling finger, I switched the main view from the forward camera to the rear. The image that flooded the screen stole the air from my lungs. My blood didn't just run cold, it turned to ice. It was no longer on the horizon. The black rectangle, the impossible hole in the stars, was now less than 5 kilometers behind the rover. It had moved. It had crossed more than 20 kilometers of open terrain in the time I'd been arguing with Rostova. But that wasn't the most terrifying part. The lunar dust between the rover and the shape was pristine, untouched. There were no tracks, no blast marks, no sign of passage whatsoever. It hadn't flown, it hadn't driven, it had simply been there, and now it was here. It was closing in. "Commander!" I yelled, my voice cracking. "Look, now, rear camera." Rostova was strapping a backup power cell into a wall locker. She didn't even turn around. "Thorn, I gave you an order. Shut down your systems and prepare for lockdown. We have 40 minutes. You don't understand. It moved." I was on my feet now, jabbing a finger at the screen. "It's following the rover. There are no tracks." "Focus on your station, Doctor," she snapped, her voice a whip crack of authority. "The solar storm is our only concern. I will not have my crew devolving into hysterics when our lives are on the line. Now, do your job." I stared at her back, then at Kenji, who was frantically pulling levers on the main power conduit, sweat beading on his forehead. They were sealed in their own reality, a world where the only monsters were ones you could measure with a Geiger counter. The final lockdown alarm began to sound, a deep, rhythmic boom that vibrated through the floor plates. It was time. We scrambled down the central corridor to the storm shelter, a cramped, lead-lined box barely large enough for 3 people, set in the core of the station. As Rostova began to cycle the heavy, vault-like door, I took one last, desperate look back at the command module's main screen. On it, the rover crawled toward safety, and behind it, patient and silent, the perfect black shape crept closer. The heavy door hissed shut, and the bolts slammed home with a deafening finality. I was trapped in a coffin with 2 people who thought I was losing my mind, while I knew, with a certainty that burned in my soul, that the real storm wasn't the one outside. It was following us home. The moment the storm shelter door boomed shut, the universe shrank to the size of a metal box. The air, thick with the scent of recycled coolant and our own rising fear, became instantly claustrophobic. The only light came from the emergency system, a single strip on the ceiling that bathed the 3 of us in a hellish, visceral red. We were no longer scientists or soldiers. We were just meat, trapped in a cage, painted in the color of blood. Rostova stood rigid, her back pressed against the far wall, a statue of defiance. Kenji, slick with sweat, slumped onto the narrow bench, nervously tapping a sequence on his knee. A diagnostic routine, I realized. A prayer in binary. I was wedged between them, the proximity to their skepticism, a physical weight. They were afraid of the storm. I was afraid of what was coming with it. The first wave hit not as a sound, but as a vibration that hummed up through the soles of my boots. a low, resonant thrum that grew in intensity until the very atoms of the station seemed to buzz. Then came the shriek. It was a high, keening scream of tortured metal as the outer hull contracted under the assault of charged particles. Tenebris wasn't just being hit, it was crying out in agony. "Holding steady," Rostova said, her voice tight, forced. "Shielding is at 92%. But the station's groans were just the opening act. The power began to fluctuate. It wasn't the sputtering flicker of a failing system. This was different. The red emergency light would dim almost to black, plunging us into a terrifying, heart-stopping darkness, only to surge back a second later to an unnatural, painful brightness. The rhythm was slow, deliberate. Dim, bright, dim, bright. Like a slow, cosmic heartbeat. Or a probe. "What's wrong with the power?" I asked, my voice thin. "Proton saturation," Kenji mumbled, not looking up from his knee-tapping. "It's playing hell with the power conduits. Just noise." But it didn't feel like noise. It felt like an intelligence, knocking on the walls, testing the locks, searching for a way in. Then, the static started. The small speaker for the emergency comms, which should have been silent, crackled to life. It was a harsh, frying sound at first, the expected noise of a solar storm tearing through electronics. I watched Kenji, expecting him to shut it off, but he was frozen, listening. Because within the static, there were other sounds. Faint, sibilant whispers slithered beneath the roar of the interference. They were too distorted to be words, but the cadence was there. And between the whispers, a sharp, unnerving click-click-clicking, like insects chittering in the walls. It's auditory pareidolia," Kenji said, though his voice lacked any conviction. "The brain trying to find patterns in chaos." Rostova just stared at the speaker, her knuckles white where she gripped the edge of a storage locker. For the first time, I saw a crack in her iron facade. She heard it too. My gaze was locked on the single, small monitor in the shelter, the one displaying the rover's telemetry. The distance counter was a beacon of hope in the red gloom. 3.4 kilometers, 2.9 kilometers, 2.1 kilometers. It was so close. Then the screen fractured into a rainbow of digital noise. The distance counter froze at 2.0 kilometers. A final, desperate squawk of static erupted from the comm speaker. And then, nothing. The screen went black. The feed was gone. "Odyssey's signal is lost," Rostova stated, her voice flat, reporting a fact that felt like a death. Our last witness was gone, swallowed by the storm. And at that precise moment, as if in answer to the rover's demise, a new alarm blared. It was a sound no one in a vacuum-sealed habitat ever wants to hear, the frantic, piercing siren of a hull breach. Louder and more insistent than the storm warning, it was the sound of imminent death. A schematic of the station flashed onto the dark monitor. A single section blinked red. "Critical alert, hull breach detected. Location, Sector Gamma Research, Pod 01. My blood turned to ice. My pod, the place where I worked, where I slept, where I cataloged the dust of this dead world. Of all the places on this station to fail, it was mine. The coincidence was too great, too targeted. It wasn't a random failure. It was a message. Tidlaw. The next hour was a blur of red light and shrieking alarms. The storm raged. The station groaned, and we were left to imagine the vacuum clawing its way into my lab, my own small sanctuary now a gaping wound. And then, as slowly as it began, the fury subsided. The shrieking of metal quieted to a low groan. The power surges ceased, leaving the emergency light at a steady, ominous red. The hull breach alarm fell silent, its purpose served. The great violence was over. Kenji, looking pale and shaken, managed to get a damage report on the monitor. Main comms array is offline, external sensors are fried, life support is on a closed loop, but the station is crippled. Rostova, all business once more, unsealed the shelter door. We assess, we repair, we survive. The air that greeted us was cold and smelled of ozone. The station was a tomb, lit by the ghostly red glow of the emergency system. I didn't follow them to the command module. I stumbled to the main viewport, my heart hammering, my breath fogging the cold plasteel. I had to see. I had to know. I had to know. I stared out at the lunar landscape, now scoured clean by the solar wind. The dust was smooth, pristine. The stars were brilliant and sharp against the perfect black of space. And the silhouette was gone. Shubasati. There was no hole in the stars, no impossible black rectangle, nothing. Just the empty, dead, familiar face of the moon. The evidence had vanished. The storm had not only crippled our station, it had scrubbed the scene of the crime clean. A chilling thought solidified in my mind. Did I see it at all? Or had the weight of the silence finally, truly broken me? The aftermath of the storm was a silence deeper and more profound than any I had ever known. The station was a corpse. The emergency red lights cast long, distorted shadows down the corridors, and the air was frigid. The main life support barely functioning on its last dregs of power. My hallucination had vanished from the landscape, leaving me alone with the chilling certainty of my own sanity and the wreckage of our home. Rostova was a machine of pure will. She didn't speak of the whispers or the targeted power surges. She compartmentalized the terror and focused on the single, insurmountable problem. We were cut off. The primary communications array is our only hope, she declared. Her voice flat in the dead air of the command module. The main screens were dark, save for a few low-power diagnostic displays. It's shielded, but the feed line from the main reactor must have been severed. Someone has to go out and reconnect it to the backup power conduit. Her eyes fell on Kenji. He looked exhausted, his face a pale mask in the red gloom, but he straightened up, nodding slowly. "I can do it," he said, his voice raspy. "The conduit runs along the exterior of the habitat module, less than 20 meters from the main airlock. It's a simple patch job." A cold dread coiled in my stomach, tight and venomous. "No," I heard myself say. "No one goes outside." Rostova turned to me, her expression a mix of pity and impatience. "Dr. Thorne, we have approximately 48 hours of oxygen on this closed loop. If we do not restore communications, we will suffocate. There is no other option." "The rover," I started, but the words died in my throat. What could I say? That I think the dead rover 2 kilometers out is dangerous? That my bad dream might hurt him? They would sedate me. Kenji placed a hand on my shoulder. "It'll be fine, Eris. A quick walk. You can be my eyes from in here. Just keep an eye on me." I could only nod, my throat too tight to speak. I watched from the command module as Kenji, a small, white figure in his bulky EVA suit, cycled through the airlock. I brought up the feed from the exterior camera overlooking the work site. He moved with a practiced, deliberate grace, a tether connecting him to the station, his tool bag floating gently beside him. He was a tiny island of life in an ocean of absolute death. The silence from his comm was unnerving. All I had was the visual and his biotelemetry on a small side screen. Heart rate, elevated but stable. O2 levels, nominal. My gut twisted with a nameless fear. My gaze kept drifting to another screen, the one that used to show the rover's feed. It was black, lifeless, a dead window, but I couldn't stop looking at it, as if expecting the darkness to stare back. Kenji reached the damaged conduit. He set to work, his movements efficient. On the screen, I could see his gloved hands manipulating the thick shielded cables. We were going to make it. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe it was all just the pressure, the isolation. Flicker. On the dead rover monitor, a single pixel flashed white, then vanished. My heart leaped into my throat. A power surge. A residual charge? Flicker. Flicker. Then, the two forward-facing lights on the Odyssey rover, 2 kilometers away in the dark, snapped on. They cut through the blackness, 2 brilliant, malevolent eyes. The screen wasn't dead anymore. The camera was active. It was looking right at the station. "No!" I whispered, my hands flying to the rover controls. I slammed the emergency shutdown command. Nothing. I tried to divert its power. Access denied. I tried to lock its wheels. Access denied. "Kenji," I said into the comm, my voice a strangled choke. "Kenji, get back inside. Now." There was no response. The comm link was one way. He couldn't hear me. On the screen, the rover twitched. It wasn't the jerky movement of a machine rebooting. It was the subtle, terrifying shift of a predator adjusting its stance. Then, with a smoothness that was utterly unnatural, it began to move. It accelerated, not with the careful trundle of a geological tool, but with the suicidal velocity of a missile. Dust plumed behind it as it tore across the lunar surface, its powerful electric motors whining at a pitch they were never designed to sustain. It was hunting. "Kenji!" I screamed, my voice uselessly echoing in the command module. I slammed my fists on the console. "Get out of there!" On the exterior camera, Kenji was still focused on his work, oblivious. The rover was a rapidly growing light in the distance behind him. The emergency comms speaker beside me exploded with the same horrific static from the storm shelter, a maelstrom of white noise and chittering clicks. It clawed at my ears, an electronic scream of rage. I watched, paralyzed by helpless horror, as the two scenes converged. The small, white figure of my friend. The monstrous, 6-wheeled predator closing in at over 100 kilometers per hour. The static on the comms cleared for a single, soul-shattering moment. It wasn't a cry for help. It wasn't a gasp of surprise. It was a scream of pure, unadulterated agony, a sound that would be burned into my memory for eternity. Kenji's scream was cut short by a sickening crunch of metal on metal, amplified by the station's own vibration sensors. On the screen, the Odyssey slammed into him, pinning his body against the communications array. The white of his suit bloomed red against the mangled antenna, his limbs twisted at impossible angles. The rover, its purpose served, ground to a halt, its lights still burning, a hunter standing over its kill. Then, the feed from the exterior camera dissolved into static. The signal died. Kenji was gone. And I was right. I was horrifyingly, devastatingly right. The silence that followed Kenji's scream was a physical thing. It filled the command module, pressing in on me, smothering me. It was the silence of a grave. I stared at the static-filled screen, where my friend had just been murdered, my mind a blank loop of his final, agonized cry. The red emergency light painted the console in front of me, making it look like it was slick with blood. Behind me I heard a sharp, ragged gasp. It was Rostova. She had been standing in the doorway, a silent witness to the entire event. I turned to look at her, my face a mask of cold shock. I expected to see dawning horror, a shared understanding of the impossible truth. Instead, I saw rage, a pure, blazing fury that burned away any trace of fear. "Equipment malfunction," she said, her voice a low, guttural snarl. The storm must have corrupted its primary motor controller. A runaway. "That was not a runaway," I said, my voice hollow, devoid of emotion. "It was aimed. It hunted him." She strode past me, her boots thudding on the deck plates. She wouldn't look at me. Her eyes were fixed on the static-filled monitor, but I knew she wasn't seeing it. She was seeing a new, more tangible enemy, a faulty machine, a tragic accident. It was something she could process, something she could fight. My version of events, a malevolent, invisible intelligence, was a madness she couldn't afford. "I'm going out there," she announced, already moving toward the EVA prep room. "Are you insane?" The words burst out of me, raw and desperate. "It's still out there. Whatever controlled the rover. The rover's power cell is nearly depleted from that suicidal run," she shot back, her words like chips of ice. "It's dead, Thorn. Dead like the rest of the station if I don't get that comms array working. Kenji died trying to save us. I will not let his sacrifice be for nothing." She paused at the doorway, finally turning to look at me, her eyes filled not with camaraderie, but with a deep, chilling suspicion. "You will stay here. You will monitor my vitals and the external cameras. Do not touch the rover controls. Do you understand?" It was an order, but it was also a threat. "You stay away from the evidence, you madman." Man. I could only watch as she suited up with a grim, practiced efficiency. She was a soldier going to retrieve a fallen comrade, her grief channeled into a dangerous, focused resolve. She was walking into the lion's den, convinced it was just a cage. The cycle of the airlock felt like a funeral dirge. Soon her white-suited figure appeared on one of the few functioning exterior cameras, this one aimed at the base of the damaged comms array. The sight was monstrous. The Odyssey rover was embedded in the delicate structure, its chassis buckled, its forward section stained with Kenji's blood. His body was a broken thing, pinned between the machine and the station. I felt a wave of nausea and turned away, focusing my attention on a secondary camera with a wider angle. I watched Rostova approach the wreck, her movements slow and deliberate. She paid no mind to Kenji's remains, her focus entirely on the machine that had killed him. She was an investigator now, looking for the flaw, the short circuit, the logical explanation. "I'm at the site," her voice came over the comm, strained but clear. "The main drive looks fused. I'm going to try and access the sample compartment. Maybe the logs will tell me what went wrong." "Eva, don't," I pleaded into the microphone, knowing it was useless. "Get away from it, please." She ignored me. I watched on the monitor as she planted her boots firmly in the regolith and began to pry at a buckled panel near the rover's sample arm. It was a piece of wreckage, nothing more. But on the secondary camera, from my wider vantage point, I saw it. It was nothing a primary sensor would ever catch. Not a light, not an energy surge. It was a flicker. A brief heat haze ripple on the rover's damaged chassis, like the air shimmering above hot asphalt. The mangled metal, which should have been cold and dead in the lunar vacuum, seemed to shift. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible movement, a contraction of less than a millimeter. A predator tensing its muscle. On the main screen, Rostova grunted with effort as she pulled on the panel. The metal groaned. As she gave one final, powerful heave, the ripple on the rover's frame intensified. The jagged, torn edge of the rover's frame, the piece she was using for leverage, suddenly flexed outward. It wasn't a break, it wasn't a collapse. It was a deliberate, calculated twitch, a flick of a wrist. Rostova was thrown off balance. Her disciplined, controlled movement turned into a clumsy stumble. She fell sideways, her arms still hooked on the panel. The jagged piece of metal she'd been pulling against, now angled like a spear tip, sliced through the thick material of her suit, right at the complex hip joint. It looked like a tragic freak accident. A tired commander, wrestling with damaged equipment, makes a fatal mistake. Pawn. But I had seen the ripple. I had seen the twitch. Pawn. Her scream was one of surprise, quickly turning to horrified realization as the suit's internal alarms blared in her helmet. Pressure loss. Critical. I saw her grab frantically at the gash, a plume of her precious, escaping oxygen crystallizing instantly in the vacuum. She thrashed for a moment, a horrifying, silent ballet of death, before collapsing to the gray dust. I watched, helpless, my hands clenched into fists, as the life faded from my commander's biotelemetry on my screen. I watched her suffocate in the silent, uncaring void. The thing out there hadn't just caused an accident, it had set a trap. And with cold, perfect precision, it had just sprung it. Time ceased to have meaning. The station's chronometers still marked the passing of hours in the red gloom, but for me, there was only the before and the after. Before, I was a member of a crew. Now I was the curator of a morgue. Nup. The digital ghosts of my crew were all around me. Kenji's final, agonized heartbeat was a flat line on one monitor. Ristova's failing suit pressure was a terminal red graph on another. The initial wave of grief and terror had receded, leaving behind something cold and hard and sharp. A forensic calm settled over me. Hysteria was a luxury I could no longer afford. I had a duty to the dead, and that duty was to know. Maluvin knock, and this was my lab now. The entire command module became my dissecting table, and the events of the last day were the body laid out upon it. I began my silent autopsy. I pulled every byte of data from the station's local servers, every cached log file, every scrap of telemetry from the moments leading up to their deaths. I created a meticulous timeline, a narrative of extinction written in code and static. First, Kenji. I replayed the footage from the exterior camera, watching the rover's murderous charge again and again. I slowed it down, frame by painful frame. The acceleration was too smooth. The trajectory was too perfect. There was no skidding, no correction, just a pure, straight line of intent. It wasn't a machine malfunctioning. It was a spear being thrown. Then, Ristova. I isolated the feed from the secondary camera, the one with the wider angle. I ran an image enhancement algorithm on the moments before she fell, focusing on the rover's mangled chassis. And there it was. Faint, but undeniable. The shimmer. The ripple in reality. The software highlighted it as a thermal and gravitational anomaly, a distortion with no source. I watched the unnatural twitch of the metal, the calculated flick that sent her stumbling into the blade of wreckage. It was a booby trap, sprung with the precision of a master assassin. I had the how, but I was still missing the what. And, more importantly, the why. My last hope was the rover itself. Its signal had died 2 kilometers out, but data packets are relentless. The station's deep space network is designed to catch and cache even the most fragmented transmissions. I dove into the comms buffer, sifting through mountains of corrupted data from the solar storm. It took hours. And then I found it. A single, 7-second data burst from the Odyssey, received and stored just seconds before its signal was lost for good. It contained the feed from the rear-facing camera. My hands were shaking as I loaded the file. The screen flickered to life, showing the gray, cratered plains receding as the rover began its recall journey. It was the same view I had seen before the lockdown, the view that held the silhouette. But it was different now. The hole in the stars was no longer a perfect, distant rectangle. It was closer, much closer. And it wasn't a solid block of nothingness anymore. How? It was unraveling. From the base of the black shape, things were moving. Tendrils of absolute blackness, thinner than wires, snaked out from the main body. They weren't solid. They seemed to be woven from the void itself. They slithered across the regolith without disturbing a single grain of dust, stretching toward the rover. I watched, my breath caught in my chest, as 3 of the filaments reached the Odyssey. They didn't clang against the metal hull. They phased through it, merging with the machine's casing as if it were smoke. In the final second of footage, the rover's running lights flickered once, and the video cut out. I finally understood. The entity didn't need to be visible to sensors. It didn't need to have mass or energy. It could touch our world, interface with our technology, possess it. It had turned our own tool into a weapon. The final, horrifying piece of the puzzle clicked into place, and the sheer, cold intellect behind it all struck me like a physical blow. It wasn't a monster rampaging blindly. It was a strategist. It killed Kenji, the engineer. Why? To remove the one person who could have repaired the station. the only one who could have overcome the damage and re-established contact. It ensured our isolation was permanent. It killed Rostova, the commander. Why? To remove the authority, the rigid chain of command, the person who would have dismissed my story and reported a simple equipment failure to any rescuers. It performed targeted assassinations, surgically removing the two pillars of our survival, leaving only me, the geologist, the observer. The entity hadn't come to destroy Tenebris Base. It had come to edit its crew. It didn't want to wipe us out. It wanted to speak to someone, and it had cleared the room for the conversation. I wasn't the sole survivor of a tragic accident. I was the objective. I was the last line of the story it wanted to tell. Days bled into one another. The station's red emergency light became my sun and my moon. The silence was absolute now, a crushing weight that felt heavier than the station's metal walls. It was a silence filled with the ghosts of my crewmates, their last moments replaying in my mind on a continuous, torturous loop. I stopped eating. I barely slept, and when I did, my dreams were of a perfect black rectangle and whispers made of static. I was adrift, in a sea of grief and terrifying revelation, waiting for the air to run out. I sat in the command module, the screens before me a memorial. On one, the looped footage of the black tendrils snaking into the rover. On another, the fatal, calculated twitch of the wreckage that killed Rostova. On a third, Kenji's final, flat-lined heartbeat. It was my testament, the truth, witnessed by a dead man, Daw. And then, a sound so alien it made me flinch, Daw. A soft, melodic chime. It was a sound of hope, of connection, of a world I thought was lost to me forever. It was the comms console. My eyes darted to a small, auxiliary unit near the floor, a device I had forgotten. A single green light glowed where before there had been only darkness. Kenji. Before he'd gone outside, in his frantic last-ditch efforts, he must have jury-rigged a bypass, a desperate Hail Mary attempt to link the low-power backup comms to the damaged array. The genius of the man, reaching out from beyond the grave. The speaker crackled, not with the hostile static of the entity, but with the gentle hiss of a long-distance connection finding its footing, and then a voice. It was clear, calm, and so breathtakingly human it brought tears to my eyes. Tenebris Base, this is Orbital Station Aegis. Do you read me? We're picking up a faint carrier signal. Tenebris, please respond. What is your status? The voice was full of concern, of procedure, of a world where things made sense. A world without impossible shapes and murderous machines. Rescue. The word bloomed in my mind, a concept so foreign it felt like a dream. I could live. I could leave this metal tomb. My hand, trembling and weak, reached for the transmit button. The evidence of the impossible truth was displayed on the screens all around me. My whole body screamed at me to tell them what happened, tell them what's out here, warn them. And as my thumb hovered over the button, the chilling, brutal logic of my situation crashed down on me. I had two choices. Tell the truth. I could open the channel and pour out the whole insane story. Orbital Station Aegis. This is Dr. Eris Thorne. Commander Rostova and Engineer Tanaka are dead. They were murdered by a non-corporeal alien entity that can control our technology. It looks like a hole in space, and it's invisible to most sensors. I have video evidence of it possessing one of our rovers and using it as a weapon. I could already hear their response. The gentle, placating tones. The concerned questions about my oxygen levels, my psychological state. Dr. Thorne, you've been through a terrible ordeal. Isolation can have profound effects. They would see a man shattered by grief and solitude, a victim of deep space psychosis. My evidence would be dismissed as sensor ghosts, data corruption from the solar flare, the exact same rationalizations Rostova had used. They wouldn't send a rescue mission. They would send a robotic probe to confirm the station's failure and my death. I would be a sad, cautionary tale, a man who cracked under the weight of the silence. The truth would die with me. Lie. I could press the button and give them the story they expected. Aegis, this is Thorn. I'm the sole survivor. My voice would crack, full of believable grief. There was a massive solar flare. It caused a catastrophic series of equipment malfunctions. The rover went haywire. Kenji was killed trying to fix the comms. The commander there was an accident during the recovery EVA. A suit breach. It was a perfect, tragic, and entirely plausible story. The station is old. Solar flares are dangerous. Accidents happen. They would rescue me. I would be brought home, a hero survivor. I would be debriefed, praised for my resilience, and then quietly retired. And humanity's first contact would be buried under a mountain of falsified reports. The silent, malevolent intelligence that stalked the lunar dust, the entity that had so carefully and methodically assassinated my crew, would remain a secret. It would be left alone, its existence unknown, waiting. My hand trembled over the transmit button. The terrible genius of the entity's plan was finally clear. It hadn't just left me alive. It had left me alive as the perfect witness to an impossible crime, knowing that the very nature of the truth would ensure it was never believed. My survival wasn't a mercy. It was the final, most cruel act of the assassination. I was not the survivor. I was the final victim, tasked with burying my own story. My gaze drifted from the transmit button to the video of the black filaments. My choice was simple: die with the truth, or live with the lie, becoming a gatekeeper to humanity's darkest secret. Either way, the entity on the moon wins. The voice from the Aegis called out again, laced with more urgency now. Tenebris Base, we read you. Please, what is your status? I took a deep, shuddering breath, the recycled air tasting of ash. I looked at the faces of my dead friends on the dark screens. Then, I pressed the button.